Somewhere in the basement of the British Museum, in a climate-controlled room that the public never sees, there are clay tablets sitting in archive trays. They are roughly the size of your palm. They are brown, cracked, and older than most countries on Earth. And pressed into their surface in a writing system that took modern scholars decades to decode is a list. Not a king list, not a tax record, not a hymn to a god, a list of species. Species that existed before humans, and next to each name, how it ended. These are Sumerian tablets. And the Sumerians are not a myth. They are the most thoroughly documented civilization in the ancient world. We have their math, we have their law codes, we have their astronomy, their medicine, their land contracts, their school curricula. We know what their children ate for lunch and what their priests wore on festival days. They were meticulous record keepers in a way that no other civilization of that era came close to matching. And these same people, these obsessive, detail-oriented, bureaucratically precise people, sat down and recorded 5 species that walked this earth before we did. The question is not whether you believe in Sumerian mythology. The question is why a civilization this precise, this methodical, this careful about the difference between fact and legend, why did they write this down as record, not as story? Why give each species a name? Why give each one a distinct set of characteristics? Why note carefully and separately how each one disappeared? That question does not have a comfortable answer, and this video is not going to pretend it does. The first species described in the tablets lived underground. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. Underground, in tunnels, in excavated chambers, in a subterranean network that, according to the Sumerian account, they built themselves. The tablets describe them as physically powerful beyond anything the Sumerians had witnessed in their own time. These were not gods being described. The language used is the same language the Sumerians used when describing a neighboring people they had heard about but never met. The tone of reported record, not invented mythology. There is a difference in Sumerian prose between cosmic metaphor and archival description. Scholars who have spent careers reading these texts recognize it. This passage reads as the latter. These beings, according to the text, came out of the earth at a specific moment in time. They surfaced, they were present, and then the tablets use a phrase that translates roughly as they returned to where they came from. They went back down. No battle, no plague, no divine punishment. They simply withdrew into the earth, and the earth closed around them, and they were not seen again. What makes this description unsettling is not the supernatural element. What makes it unsettling is the archaeological context around it. The Sumerians were themselves a civilization that built in vertical strata. Temples, water systems, entire neighborhoods layered underground. And when they excavated, when they dug down into the ground beneath their own cities, they found older structures, structures that predate them by thousands of years, structures that are clearly intentional, clearly architectural, and clearly not made by any known culture. The Sumerians believed these structures were made by the beings who lived underground before them. At the site of Uruk, arguably the world's first city, excavations have uncovered layers that current dating places thousands of years before Sumerian civilization, yet would show evidence of structured construction. Scholars attribute these to pre-Sumerian local settlements. That may be correct. But the Sumerians themselves, looking at those same foundations beneath their feet, believed something else had built them, and they wrote that belief down, not as mythology, as explanation. The second species recorded in the tablets presents a different kind of problem. These beings are described as similar to humans, but not human. The Sumerians placed them in a category they distinguished carefully from the divine and from the mortal, a third register, occupying the space in between. Their function, according to the text, was observation. They watched, they recorded, they maintained something, the tablets are not entirely clear what, from above. They operated at a higher elevation, literally or metaphorically, and their work was the work of surveillance and documentation. And then they stopped working, and then they stopped speaking. And then they were gone. The Sumerian text that scholars connect to this account, a section that often gets overlooked in the more famous translations of the Atrahasis epic, states that these beings departed in silence. Not destroyed, not defeated, not absorbed. They departed in silence, and then humans took over the functions they had been performing. Sit with that exchange for a moment, because it implies something specific. If these beings had simply died out, nothing would replace them. Replacement implies continuity of function. It implies that whatever they were doing still needed to be done, and that humans were the next candidate for doing it. The entire structure of early Sumerian cosmology, humans created to serve, to labor, to maintain, maps directly onto this moment of transition. Humans did not arrive into an empty world. They arrived into a vacancy, and the vacancy had a job description. This is not a fringe interpretation. This reading is present in various forms in the mainstream academic literature on Sumerian creation mythology. Most scholars frame it theologically. A smaller number frame it as something stranger. Both groups are reading the same text. The third species is where the Sumerian account becomes most specific and most difficult to dismiss. These beings are explicitly described as more intelligent than humans. That is the Sumerians' own claim, written in their own script, about a species they believed preceded them. A civilization that was, by any measure, one of the most intellectually sophisticated in the ancient world, looked back at what came before it and said, "They were smarter than us." That is not the language of cultural superiority. That is not propaganda. That is an admission. And admissions in ancient records are among the most reliable things we have, because people do not fabricate acknowledgments of their own inferiority without reason. The tablets describe these beings as living between land and water. Scholars have interpreted this in multiple ways. Some read it as metaphorical, a coastal or riverine culture. Some read it as literal, beings who were at home in aquatic environments in a way humans are not. A persistent minority in the academic literature argues that the description is biological, that these beings were genuinely amphibious, or at minimum semi-aquatic, in a way that distinguished them fundamentally from the Homo sapiens line. What is clear across all interpretations is what happened to them. They were destroyed by water, not slowly, not gradually, abruptly. The Sumerian account places their extinction in the context of a catastrophic flood, and this is where the record becomes both more complicated and more interesting. The Sumerian flood story predates the biblical account by at least 1,000 years. Most educated people know that. What fewer people know is that certain tablets, in passages that rarely make it into popular translations, describe the flood not as the beginning of the human story, but as the end of something older. The flood did not arrive into a world that was already human. It arrived into a world where something else was living, particularly something that thrived near water. And it destroyed that thing first. In 2010, researchers began taking seriously what is now called the Gulf Oasis hypothesis, the idea that the Persian Gulf Basin, during the last ice age, was largely dry land, a fertile, river-fed basin covering thousands of square kilometers, a place where large populations could have lived and thrived. And then, as sea levels rose following the end of the Younger Dryas period, that entire landscape flooded, rapidly. Whatever was there, when whoever was there, went underwater. The timeline matches the Sumerian flood accounts within the margin of oral tradition error. The geography matches what the tablets describe, and that sunken landscape is still there, on the floor of the Persian Gulf, unexcavated, largely unexplored. Whatever it contains, we have not yet looked. The third species, according to the Sumerians, was the most intelligent. It was the most connected to water, and it was the first to go. The fourth species is the one that keeps people up at night. The Sumerian description of this fourth group, preserved most completely in the Nippur tablet assemblage, a collection whose translation remains ongoing, contains a phrase that scholars have struggled with for over a century. The beings are described as smaller than fire, but larger than water. Now, this is clearly idiomatic. The debate is about what idiom it encodes. Some scholars read it as a description of their relationship to temperature extremes, that they were vulnerable to both intense heat and intense cold in ways that limited their range and ultimately their survival. Some read it as a scale metaphor, that they occupied a middle position in some elemental taxonomy the Sumerians used to classify non-human intelligence. Some read it as a description of their energy, volatile, intense, but ultimately diffuse. None of these interpretations fully satisfy, and the one that satisfies least, the one that appears least often in peer-reviewed literature, but most persistently in the footnotes of scholars who have spent the most time with the text, is also the one that is hardest to set aside, that the description is not metaphorical at all, that it is a straightforward attempt to describe a biology that the Sumerians observed but could not fully explain in the vocabulary available to them. But all of that is secondary, because what the tablets say about how this species ended is not ambiguous. It does not require interpretation. It is stated plainly. They destroyed each other. The Sumerian text uses a specific word for this process, a word that translates literally as wrong understanding of boundary. They went to war with themselves because they could not correctly identify where they ended and something else began. They could not recognize their own limits. They could not accept the edge of their own domain. And in that failure of self-recognition, they eliminated themselves completely, not partially, not nearly, completely. There is a specific silence that falls over a room when someone reads that passage aloud for the first time. Because nothing in that description is specific to ancient beings. Nothing in it requires a mythology to explain. A species that was more powerful than anything around it, that destroyed itself through a wrong understanding of its own boundaries. That story does not belong only to the fourth species on a Sumerian tablet. That story is recognizable. That story is current. And the Sumerians, writing it down as a record of something that had already happened, may have understood that they were also writing a warning about something that had not happened yet. The fifth species is described in a single sentence. The first four each have characteristics. Each has a distinct profile: habitat, function, intelligence level, interaction with the world. Each has an ending that is described with at least some specificity. The fifth has none of this. One sentence. They departed when humans arrived. Not destroyed, not absorbed, not killed. Departed. Scholars take this in two directions. The first is that departed is a euphemism for absorption, that this fifth group interbred with early humans, was genetically incorporated, and what they were is now distributed through us, invisible but present. The second interpretation is more literal and more unsettling, that they left, that they went somewhere, that there was a somewhere to go, and the tablets provide no information about where that somewhere was. In a civilization that left nothing incomplete, this is the most conspicuous gap in the entire record. The Sumerians completed things. Their mathematical tables are complete. Their astronomical observations are complete. Their legal codes are complete. Their king lists run unbroken for thousands of years. And here, at the end of the most significant cosmological accounting they ever attempted, a list of every species that existed before humanity, there is one entry that ends not with a death, but with a disappearance, and not a word about the destination. There are three possible reasons for this. The first, the writer did not know. The second, the writer knew but chose not to say. The third, and this is the one that the silence itself most strongly suggests, the writer was not permitted to say. Not every archive omission is ignorance. Some omissions are instructions. Some blank spaces are sealed doors. And this one has been sealed for 5,000 years. Now consider where modern science stands on all of this, because this is where the conversation stops being comfortable for everyone, regardless of what they believe. The standard academic position is that the Sumerians were mythologizing, that the Anunnaki, the Agigi, the beings between land and water, these are theological constructs, not zoological records. That the appropriate framework for reading these texts is religious literature, not natural history. This position is defensible. It is the consensus. It deserves to be stated clearly and taken seriously. But in 2010, the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome revealed that modern non-African humans carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. Interbreeding had occurred. We are not purely Homo sapiens. Something else is in us, distributed invisibly through every non-African human alive today, belonging to a species that has been extinct for 40,000 years. In 2011, a fingerbone fragment and a tooth found in Denisova cave in Siberia were analyzed and found to represent an entirely new species of hominin, the Denisovans, whose DNA shows up measurably in Pacific Islander and certain South Asian populations today. A species that no one knew existed until 2011, a species that left genetic traces across thousands of miles of geography, a species that is gone and yet still present in us. In 2019, Homo luzonensis was identified in the Philippines. In 2021, the dragonman skull in China was described as potentially representing yet another previously unknown hominin species. Each year, the count of species we share this planet's recent past with goes up. Each year, the picture of human prehistory becomes more crowded, more complex, and less like the simple linear progression we were taught in school. We have discovered, in a handful of decades, multiple species that existed before modern humans dominated the Earth. Species that were, by any definition, intelligent. Species that are gone, some catastrophically, some quietly, some in ways we still cannot fully explain. And these species, these real, genetically verified, peer-reviewed species, are not entirely distant from the descriptions in Sumerian tablets. The beings like humans but not human, how far is that from Neanderthal? The intelligent species that live between land and water, how far is that from Denisovan populations we now know existed in coastal Southeast Asia? The beings who disappeared when humans arrived, how far is that from the pattern we see in the fossil record, where every hominin species that came into contact with Homo sapiens ultimately vanished? I am not arguing that Sumerians were writing about Denisovans. I am arguing that Sumerians lived in a world where the oral memory of multiple coexisting hominin species was not ancient history. It was recent history, where 40,000 years of accumulated story passed generation to generation preserved in distorted but recognizable form the fact that we were not always alone, that there were others, that they are gone, and that each one ended differently. The Sumerians were not alone in knowing this. Thousands of miles from Mesopotamia, Vedic texts describe a cosmological system in which each great age, each yuga, was inhabited by different kinds of beings. Humans belong to the Kali Yuga, the last and least of the ages. The earlier ages contained something more capable, more aware, more complete, and that something diminished, age by age, species by species, until we arrived. Chinese pre-Confucian texts describe pre-human sovereigns, who were not human, but were more than human, beings who shaped the world before people were capable of shaping it themselves. They ruled. They departed. We inherited what they left. Aboriginal Australian oral tradition, arguably the oldest continuous oral tradition on Earth, extending back an estimated 65,000 years, explicitly records that other kinds of people were here before. The dream time is not simply metaphor. It is preserved memory. And in that memory, there are other kinds of beings who share the timeline of this continent's history. These are separate civilizations, separate languages, separate continents. They are not copying each other. The only explanation for independent convergence on the same specific claim, that multiple non-human species preceded us, that each ended differently, that their ending made way for us, is either universal mythological coincidence or universal mythological memory. And there is a point at which the density of the coincidence starts to look less like accident and more like echo. Come back to where this began. Those tablets, that clay, that anonymous Sumerian hand pressing a stylus into wet earth and recording a list that no one asked for, a list of what came before, preserved for an audience that had not yet been born. What was that person thinking? Did they understand what they were preserving? Did the weight of it press down on them the way the stylus pressed into the clay? Did they feel, in the act of writing, a responsibility they could not entirely name, a sense that these names, these endings, these carefully noted fates deserved to be held by someone, even if that someone would not exist for another 3,000 years? Or were they simply doing their job, writing what tradition had given them, passing on what they had been taught, adding one more layer of record to a civilization built entirely on the principle that things must be written down? We do not know. We know nothing about the person who wrote this, not their name, not their rank, not whether they wrote by lamplight or daylight, in a city or in a village, in a moment of inspiration or in the middle of a routine administrative morning. And perhaps that is fitting, because that person knew nothing firsthand about the species they were recording either. They were transmitting received information, a chain of transmission stretching back further than their own memory could reach. And at the far end of that chain, at the very origin of it, so were beings who had witnessed it directly, or who had lived it directly, or who, in some cases, were it. 5 species, 5 endings, and we came after all 5. The first went back underground, recalled, withdrawn, as if the earth itself had issued a summons and they obeyed. The second departed in silence. No war, no disease, no farewell. Simply frequency lost, signal gone. The third was taken by water, by a flood that exists not just in Sumerian clay, but in the oral record of nearly every major culture on every continent, a global memory of a drowning that was not only ours. The fourth destroyed itself. Wrong understanding of boundary, a species that could not recognize where it ended and something else began, and paid for that failure with everything it had. And the fifth simply left. Where? The tablets do not say. The tablets are silent. The silence has lasted 5,000 years. And then we arrived. We, the species, still here. The species that built the tablets and the pyramids and the penicillin and the nuclear warhead and the internet and the industrial agricultural system that is currently reshaping the planet's atmosphere. We are the species that outlived the other 5, or succeeded them, or replaced them. The record is not entirely clear on which. If something were observing us now, something patient, something distant, something keeping its own records, what would it write about us? In which column of its own list would we belong? Would we be the ones who went underground, who retreated, who withdrew, who returned to something older? Would we be the ones who departed in silence, leaving behind only the artifacts of a civilization that once was? Would we be the ones taken by water, by the seas we have spent 2 centuries raising? Would we be the fourth, the ones who could not understand their own boundary, who turned their intelligence against themselves and finished the job completely? Or would we be the fifth, the ones who simply left? Where? Unknown, but left. The Sumerian tablets cannot answer that question. They can only hold it, pressed into clay, preserved under dust, waiting in a room that smells like controlled air and ancient patience for someone to read it again and understand that this list was never finished. It still has one entry left to write, because lists of species that came and went. Those lists do not write themselves. Someone has to notice. Someone has to care enough to record it. Someone has to believe that the future will want to know. The Sumerians believed that. They pressed it into clay. They preserved it. And now we are the future they were writing for, reading a tablet that is telling us something we have not yet decided whether we want to hear. The entry is still blank, and we are the only ones left who can determine what it says.